Support for the Choral Commons comes from the University of San Diego, the Karen and Tom Mulvaney Center for Community, Awareness and Social Action, and the College of Arts and Sciences Arts Engagement Initiative.
USD's Arts Engagement Initiative supports artistic action embedded in and responsive to ever-changing social, cultural, and political circumstances, deep and meaningful engagement with community, and increased access to the arts on the USD campus and beyond.
The Choral Commons is a community where choral music practitioners and organizations can gather in order to envision equity-centered choral futures. With our community and creative partners, we hope to empower choral practitioners with additional strategies for innovation grounded in culturally responsive, critical, and equity-centered values.
My name is Emily Amrine.
And I am Andre de Quadros.
And this is the Choral Commons podcast.
Decolonization is, to me, in the choral craft, framing away from a Eurocentric gaze, topically and structurally, right? Because we cannot expect to use the choral body and welcome in the words diversity and inclusivity if we don't frame things away from a white narrative.
Indigenous people have been subjected to colonization for centuries. However, by contrast with several other settler nations, the genocide of Indigenous people in the United States has rarely entered the mainstream narrative. Recently, some in our profession are interrogating the colonial nature of the Euro paradigm of choral music while searching for more expressive and authentic expressions of Indigenous culture. Conductor, educator, and scholar Dr. Jace Kaholokula Saplan is known for his work in celebrating the intersection between Hawaiian music and choral performance. He is Director of Choral Activities and Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Hawai'i, and the founder and artistic director of Nā Wai Chamber Choir. Nā Wai Chamber Choir is a treble ensemble dedicated to the preservation, propagation, and innovation of Hawaiian choral music. They perform a diverse array of repertoire from across the world, rooting process and perspectives through a Hawaiian lens. Since 2009, Nā Wai has commissioned and mentored emerging Native Hawaiian composers and choral musicians, toured throughout rural Hawaiian communities, and led workshops on the performance of Hawaiian choral music throughout the country. It's so lovely to be with you today, Jace. Thank you so much for being with us. It's here the middle of July. I'm in San Diego. Andre's in Boston. You are in Hawaii. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to the last couple weeks in terms of the pandemic and the racial uprisings and what's been going on in your life?
These past couple of weeks have been incredibly interesting, and I think have provided a lot of entry points for myself, for my community of artists and singers, to really look deeply at how we are connected, or our concept of pilina, which is a Hawaiian metaphor for how we're interwoven within the national conversation, the national fabric of critique right now. And I think it's super interesting for us as we begun having these conversations on Zoom, where, we've kind of have explored, or I think realized, that when we try to unpack who we are and what our responsibility is to the Black Lives Matter movement with racial uprising, and when we begin to explore what allyship means and what allyship looks like as Indigenous practitioners, as Native Hawaiian choral artists, we begin to realize that allyship is framed through a white gaze. And it's framed through a gaze that we don't really see ourselves in. And so our work through much of the pandemic has been exploring responsibility, or kuleana, towards what does it mean as an Indigenous or as a Native ally that has both underwent a historical narrative of racism, but also has a responsibility to connect or to be in pilino with Black lives and Black artists and Black narratives.
Let's open things up a little bit and give some context to who you are and where you're working and the indigeneity that you've already referenced today. So tell us a little bit about like your story, your trajectory.
So I'm going to get started from the very beginning. I was born and raised in the Ahupua'a, or in the land division of the Big Island of Waiakea. And it's near the harbor town of Hilo on East Hawaii. I grew up in a family that revered their Native identity, but I grew up with a family in which my mother and my father inherited a lot of trauma in relationship with their Native or their Hawaiian identities. My mother was adopted. Both of my parents were separated from their language and from cultural traditions because during their upbringing, it was illegal to speak Hawaiian. And there was this constant need to acculturate oneself to a Western identity, to Western standards of academic excellence, to white oneself. And when I was raised, when I was brought into this world, it was right after this gathering or this need of a Hawaiian Renaissance, and so these Native Hawaiian speaking schools, these opportunities to relearn and to decolonize or to attempt to decolonize one's mind and align oneself towards one's culture began. And I was put in a school system called Ahapuna Leo, where I was raised and had the opportunity to use my language, to the Native Hawaiian language, Olelo Hawaii, as my first language, to see the world through that lens. My parents worked really hard to try to afford me all of these opportunities to partake in hula, to see and to practice music with my grandmother, because at that point my grandmother realized it was time to start teaching again. And so because of their sacrifices and because of the trauma they endured, I was allowed this opportunity to step into the identity as a Hawaiian. I was also gifted the responsibility to identify as Mahu, which is a gender expression and a gender identity that's passed down within an Indigenous context. And the term Mahu means to identify in the middle between gender expressions of Hina, what is traditionally feminine, and Ku, which is what is traditionally masculine. But what's important to note is that it's not something you come in necessarily identifying for your own behalf. It's a gender expression with the responsibility of passing on your culture, your songs, your chants. Because I was gifted that identity, I knew that for much of my life, I saw responsibility in Native musicking, in communal music, in even Hawaiian choral performance practice of the late 1800s. So I sang in choir throughout high school and middle school. I found a sense of Hawaiian identity. I pursued music education in my undergraduate degree at the University of Hawai'i. And then I asked myself really critical questions when I started graduate work and finished graduate work about, here is this body of communal music making that served as a tool for cultural genocide. So what is my responsibility to this craft that I've studied for so long? And how can I use this craft not as a means for further creating generational trauma and separation from one's identity, but to help unify it?
There's so much to unpack here. And I know, Andre, you have a question. But before we do that, I'm wondering, for the average listener to the Choral Commons, who might have an imagination of what Hawaiian culture is that is maybe two-dimensional or stereotypical, I'm wondering if you can briefly just paint a picture of what Indigenous Native Hawaiian culture might look like that expands and extends outside of that two-dimensional framework. And also, let's start there.
Sure.
I mean, I know it's like, it's like an impossible question. Like, can you briefly, like, invoke all of this amazing, rich tapestry of culture? But I guess I just really want to point to the fact that this is not, like, that the imagination of Native Hawaiian culture is something that contributes to some problems, right? So I want to kind of make it a little more nuanced, if you can.
Oh yeah, totally. It's important to note that because we are a series of islands, and because geography can contribute a lot of problematic interpretations of identity based on colonialism, settler behavior, and the like. And because we don't have a lot of landmass in comparison to other places in the world, in the late 1800s, when we endured and when we existed in community with 50 to 80 years of an established missionary presence, we then had countries from all over the world coming in to Hawaii to participate in the sugarcane plantation expeditions. And it was not only a means of coming together for capital gain, but it created this ecosystem where in this very small landmass, you had a complex web of identities that came together to create this unique ecosystem of culture. And while I think that in many capacities, that's a beautiful narrative to uphold, while all of this is happening on native land. And in doing so, and in all of these things happening, we lose a sense of what it means to be Hawaiian, or we are given the reality to innovate or to recontextualize what it meant to be Hawaiian and what Hawaiian music sounds like. Case in point, in the late 1800s, Liliuokalani, a native Hawaiian composer, the last queen of the Hawaiian kingdom, writes music in 3/4 time because she's connecting to the Germanic band world that was introduced. At this time, Hawaiian choirs use hymnody and homophonic textures as a means to protest against American presence. At this time, the ukulele begins to be synonymous with Hawaiian culture without referencing the fact that it was introduced from Portugal. And we go through this cycle through years and years and years with the tourism industry and Blue Hawaii and the radio station Hawaii Calls, and we begin to endure cycles of sonic colonialism and sonic colonial behavior. And our method of resistance is reclaiming these sound worlds, reclaiming these rituals, and decolonizing these rituals so that it's a means for Hawaiian community building and Hawaiian identity making.
I think you raise so many profound matters that I personally identify with because as somebody whose family was converted to Christianity from Hinduism and who's which still also kept the caste system alive and were expected to subvert some very essential and traditional aspects of Indian culture, and then we almost own the culture of the colonizers, which is in a sense tragic. But I think I'm going to ask I think 2 or 3 questions that I think are critical that come out of what you're talking about. You talked about Pilina, and I think that Pilina is an interesting metaphor for this idea of almost common ground, of binding together, of unifying. And I'm wondering whether Pilina in this time, in 2020, in this fractured time, that the concept of Pilina, which is of course an old word, can be a way in which one bridges not only the divide and the segregation and the divergent aspirations of so many people, but can also find a way, not only in Hawaii but also nationally and internationally. What's the Pilina message, if you like?
Wow. I mean, to think of how Hawaiian values and a Hawaiian concept can connect to a global phenomena is really humbling to think about. Um, what Pilina allows us to do is to move past the surface of performative connection, right? It recognizes when we connect to something, when I say, hey, can we foster Pilina right now? What that tells the learners in the environment is that it's not just yourself in this conversation. It's those that have come before you and that have endured and that have innovated and that have undergone an amalgamation of things. And it's also those that will come after you. So it's that, and it creates, from what I have observed and how I view that word, it creates a sense of reverence. And it allows me to look past myself, and it allows me to see my body as a container of history and of the future. And all the more reason that when I connect to something, I'm not just bringing my experiences, I'm bringing my ancestors' experiences, and I'm bringing those that will come after me as well, of all of the identities that I encapsulate.
But
So,
I think what the way you're speaking is so different to the way our core conducting profession speaks about. It's talking about colonizing, you're talking about history, you're talking about the body as a container for the past generations and so on. But at the same time, what you're doing, which is quite extraordinary, is you're able to bring an intellectual conceptualization, a framing and a reframing of this vocabulary, these important symbols and ways of seeing the world, a Hawaiian worldview, such as Pilina, and I'm wondering whether that makes sense. Now, I'm asking this question the same way that we talked about how Ubuntu in South Africa was a kind of a way in which we might think about community and so on. So I think we all understand that the way in which we think, the way in which we feel, the way in which we've organized the world is of a kind that we don't want to continue. So we need new metaphors, new ideas, new concepts, new feelings,
new stories, right?
New stories, exactly.
Right.
So that's why I asked the thing about Pilina. Is my question making a bit more sense? Help me to be more Pilina kind of minded, if you like.
right? Yeah, I mean, to kind of circle back on like this idea of who we are as containers or whatever, and just kind of circling in on language too. What that teaches us in a choral context is that when we do these performative exercises of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, what that means is it has to go past topical connection. It has to go towards structural or pedagogical connection. If we aren't teaching Native and Indigenous lives and bodies, or any BIPOC identities, that they have a responsibility to allowing the works of Eurocentric composers, to connect to the works of Eurocentric composers, and that their musical lineage can teach and have things to offer towards Eurocentric performance practice, then we're not doing our work in creating pilina between these two divisions or within these silos of our craft justice. I think when I scaffold a lesson or when I'm working here within the context of my Native identity and also a choral conductor, how am I going to interweave or create pilina between, let's say, Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus and a name chant that they were gifted when they were young? What are the connections between those two? And how can I teach towards connection as opposed to this piece goes here in this act of performance, this piece goes here, and never the two shall meet? If I can't create pilina in my programming, then we can't create pilina within the lives of our students and how they see themselves in the craft.
So what I thought was so interesting about how you were characterizing the connection that is pilina is that it's not just like a lateral thing, right? It's not like it's not a relationship between me and you and Andre and me and like the kind of interlocking of present, right? It's also time bound, and it is a different way of thinking about time that isn't linear. And I think it's a really great entry point into understanding indigeneity as a way of knowing as much as an identity, and to think in with a different set of lenses and conceptualize time as something that can be embodied both past, present, and future in your body. I mean, that's just such a radical idea for people who identify as, coming from that Western European settler colonial framework. And it's an amazing idea. And I love the way that you talk about it in terms of the programming. But I guess I'm wondering if you can also connect it to what you were talking about in terms of your own identity and gender expression and the idea of responsibility and vocation and how all of that is how that lives in you.
Honestly, I'm still figuring it out. And I don't think I'll ever figure it out. And I think that's the beauty of this conundrum. When I started graduate school, I still didn't really identify as a choral conductor. And honestly, I still hold that term and that identity within my body with a lot of critique, with a lot of personal critique, because when we think about the craft of choral conducting and who we are as choral conductors and the way that our profession looks like from the day to day, from K through 12, community, professional, semi-professional, university, all those things, they look so different from each other that it's hard to encapsulate that term and what lens you are using, since we're talking about lens and bodies right now. And so I know first and foremost that I identify as a Native Hawaiian cultural practitioner, and that I have a responsibility to, because of my Mahu identity, to pass on music, to pass on stories. Native cultures, our cultures everywhere, is so contingent upon storytelling and narrative that when I view a rehearsal, that's not necessarily a rehearsal. It's a time to be in communion with narrative and mo'olelo is what we call it, or stories.
Jace, let me take you back a little bit to when you said because of your Mahu identity, and for those who are not so familiar with issues of gender identity and sexual orientation, that this idea that somehow queer, and I think for a lot of people, transgender has been seen as a concept of dysphoria, and as you and I have talked about before, that seeing it as almost an aberration, although not everybody may see it that way in conventional Western society. But nevertheless, we've inherited this sense in which it's an aberration. Whereas Mahu speaks about gender identity, sexual orientation totally differently. And I'm wondering if you can just come back a little bit to where you were saying about because your Mahu identity and so on, that it allows you to be a different kind of choral conductor. Can you talk about that a bit here now?
Sure. The point that I connect to the most is on the concept of gesture, the concept of conducting. To reference one of my favorite books right now, Bodies Out of Bounds by Jana Evans Braziel and Kathleen Lebesco. One of my favorite novels about understanding bodies and gesture and thinking about how when we talk about conducting and when we talk about gesture in our craft, a lot of it is framed through the lens of ableism, right? So how I view my Mahu identity within this craft and as a storyteller of gesture and of motion, um, being Mahu allows me to encapsulate an expansive perspective of the feminine, of the masculine, of the things in between, and how the body is able to communicate these moments of gesture that spur sound, much like hula can do. And it allows my students, through what we could consider a Western perspective of androgyny, to see this canvas of sound where we're able to remove our bias of gendered interpretations of gesture and see a connection, a pilina, if you will, between sound and movement, interwoven in storytelling.
I mean, so you're raising an interesting question, which I've heard people refer to in other ways. In other words, the gesture of choral conducting, the figures, the way we beat, which we become accustomed to thinking is pretty standard. It's been developed by white men essentially, and as I think somehow it came into being through white men, and even if it didn't, the documentation, the fixing of it by people like Max Rudolph and so on have made it a kind of a taxonomy that's almost inviolable. And I've got this great story of when I was doing a conducting project in Bali, and there was a choral conductor who was conducting choir in performance, and there were these Balinese gamelan players on the side, and they were young. There was these young guys, and they were laughing at the choral conductor. And every time they did something, they'd throw their hands up, and I went to them and I said, "What's funny?" And they said, "Look at this person. She's not doing anything. She's just moving her hands." I said, "Don't you understand that her hands are communicating the way in which these people should sing?" He said, "But she's not making any music. I mean, anybody can move their hands." And I couldn't persuade them that she was doing anything that was musically meaningful. They were there making jokes. This is during a concert, right? And these are very traditional Balinese gamelan players. And my colleague Emily Howe and I were there. We were just remarking about this because we think that this is somehow, this grammar of gesture is somehow universal, and it couldn't be any other way. But you're raising something that's really, really fundamental and critical here. There are alternative ways of communicating other than what we've been handed down to, right?
But not just alternatives, right? Like I'm just so struck by the way that you opened this segment of the conversation, Andre, in terms of talking about sexuality and gender as being somehow transgressive. And this comes back to what Jace, you were saying at the beginning, as even like the idea of allyship through the lens of whiteness, right? That we are framing sexuality as normal and something that's not normal, right? Or like something that is in the center and something is in the margins, right? And that it's kind of coming from the position of the center that casts anything that is non-conforming as transgressive, as different, as alternative, and this is in terms of sexuality, it's in terms of bodies and ableism and disability, it's in terms of gender, it's in terms of the language of conducting, it's in terms of this idea of whiteness and the social construction of blackness that is created by whiteness in order to exploit and enslave. So all of these ideas, I think, come back to the framework of decolonization and decoloniality. And so I'm wondering, because we've talked now today about a lot of kind of conceptual things, and I love this. I'm wondering, like, if you were going to give like an entryway to understanding what decoloniality or decolonization is in terms of choral practice, like how can you like take me by the hand and like help me to understand it if I haven't read, decolonization is not a metaphor.
It's so easy to have these conversations that are zoomed in, but to zoom out, I would encourage all of us to ask ourselves these questions, right? So the first question I would ask when we begin to think about what decolonization is in and of itself, before I address the questions, what decolonization is to me in the choral craft is framing away from a Eurocentric gaze, topically and structurally, right? Because we cannot expect to use the choral body and welcome in the words diversity and inclusivity if we don't frame things away from a white narrative, right?
Right. But even go further back. Like, what does that even mean, like Eurocentric gaze? Because I understand what you're talking about, but like, like, what does that mean? Like, how is choral practice coming from that position? Like, what does it mean when you say that?
Right. So I think people don't realize is that choral performance and the act of choral singing was an important tool for America, for Europe, to use as a way to acculturate brown bodies, black bodies, indigenous bodies, anything that's not white, to forget, to move away, to decenter themselves away from their rituals, and to use choir as a ritual to colonize or to reframe their perspectives to a colonial perspective. Does that make sense? So I'm forgetting my rituals. I am no longer allowed to use these practices as a non-white person.
Right. This is like what you're talking about, cultural genocide, right? Like the erasure of language, the erasure of music, the erasure of rituals, the erasure of identities, the erasure of all of these things. That is like the framework of the elimination of the native, right? Like this is like what the colonial settler orientation to the world is about. But I guess I just feel like there might be many, like a lot maybe, of folks in the choral world who don't like, I mean, for whom even what we're talking about now is so foreign of a concept, and that's distressing to me. And so I'm trying to figure out how we can kind of like...
But it's not really, I mean, it's distressing because in a sense, part of the genocide issues that arise is that we only then are able to talk in the language of the colonizers. So if you think about, I know that you've been looking at Queen Lili Okalani's compositions, but she was writing in a literate using Western notation, and what people dress, the kinds of modes of dress, the fact that Native Hawaiians, who I mean, just until a few years ago, the language Olelo Hawaii was considered an endangered language by UNESCO. I mean, now it's considered a little bit less endangered, but it's not out of the woods, so to speak. So this is the tragedy of cultural genocide, that we actually are forced to adopt the clothes of the people who colonized us. And
right.
How do you like make sense of it, both of you? I mean, how do you reconcile it? If if the discursive practices of settler coloniality have this malignancy in it, right? Like in them, how is it possible that you can then, in your mind, reconcile participating even? I mean, I hear all of what you're talking about, both of you, in terms of cultural genocide, and it like makes me, like, my body feels repulsed by like the traditions of the practice. And I mean, I'm saying this and I'm probably going to edit it out of like the conversation, but like I feel this honestly. Like, how can I continue to uphold and reproduce and participate in like canon building and affirming whiteness and like settler coloniality in choral practice? Like, it's a participant, like the music and the practices of choral music, it is complicit in the erasure and the cultural genocide that you're talking about. Like, how do I, or how do you reconcile that?
We don't have enough time, Emily. We don't.
We don't have enough time to talk about that. So let me wait.
Like, no, listen, no, like, I think, can you just like can you respond like just briefly even? Like, I know there's not enough time, but
no. Yeah, I think, where am I? There's so many entry points that we can go with this, because it to decolonize oneself as a Native person is a very different practice than calling out colonialist behavior or asking a white colleague to decolonize their gaze, right? When we come to the concept of decolonization amongst a marginalized identity, they are basically unlearning themselves as a means of emancipation, not themselves, but like narratives as a means of emancipation, or switching power structures of understanding their own narrative. Case in point, there's a hymn called Nu'oli, Glad Tidings, from the book of Luke from the Bible. Normally a hymn that is sung throughout the world, but Nu'oli has an incredible place in my heart in terms of how I access and remember my grandmother and my mother, right? Was also the first hymn that was recorded to be sung and to be delivered at the first Congregationalist gathering in the Kingdom of Hawaii. So this hymn that resulted in centuries of acculturation away from one's Native identity towards a white narrative and an entirely different tradition, is also has room in my heart of complete nostalgia. It was the song my mother sang to me when, as a young child, to rouse me to sleep. It was the very first song my grandmother taught me on the ukulele and started an entire lifetime of music making, right? Like, I have to understand that my relationship, my pilina with that song, is incredibly complex, but also needs to be labeled as problematic. It's taking a look at this lineage of the sound world that I am in relationship with and looking at it with ways that I need to be aware of my relationship to that sonic history, and I need to call it out, right? And that was met with moments of struggle.
So let's talk about this diversity and inclusion business that you referred to earlier, Jace. It has been said relatively recently amongst some folks that this current uprising draws attention to the serious history and the brutalization of African Americans for centuries. But in all the conversations, it has been said that indigenous people have been somehow neglected, even though there's an I in the BIPOC for indigenous. For most people, they're not familiar with that. And the reason I'm bringing this up is when I first came to the United States almost 20 years ago from Australia, where it is the substance of all conversations about race, this issue of Aboriginal people and the genocide. And when I came here, it's almost never spoken about. And I'm wondering if where you find a place for yourself as an indigenous person in this larger conversation on racism?
It's hard to create a body of allyship if you, as a culture bearer, make up less than 2% of the national population, right? So how do I find myself specifically was the question.
Yes, but not only how you find yourself, but how do you find as a culture bearer and
Mhm.
as a kind of a almost like a standard bearer for Indigenous people in Hawaii, but also for Indigenous people all over the world.
Right.
And I think that this is the issue. If you look at some of the demonstrations that are happening in many cities, they're talking about police violence, and I want to say that, for example, there was a video of the brutality of Chauvin over George Floyd, and as there have been many others. But one of my formerly incarcerated folks talked to me, said there are no videos of the brutality against people who are in prison, and so in this big conversation, we talk about what's happening in the streets with police, but we don't talk about what's happening in prisons enough.
Right.
And
Right.
so what I'm trying to say is that the brutality of coloniality, the brutality of race, the brutality of in so many forms is so diverse and must be spoken about in so many ways, that I'm wondering that this issue of Indigenous people is obviously close to your heart. How do you speak to that?
Oh yeah. It's so interesting as an Indigenous person being in communion with other Indigenous/Native Hawaiians, framing a dialogue that is Native Hawaiian centered on our responsibility and our relationship, specifically around the Black Lives Movement and how it connects to other conversations. One of the biggest things that we've struggled with was understanding that all of this uprising, all of these conversations and these demonstrations that rooted from horrific events rooted in racism happened on stolen land.
Of course.
And that when you zoom in and zoom out on a micro and a meta context, I mean, that's really problematic. And we wrestle in a very vulnerable way with all of what's happening, right? I think this framing around what it means to be anti-racist is framed within a black and a white
Binary.
umbrella,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, just like there's a gender binary, there is a race binary around our responsibility as a country to be anti-racist, right? And where do we fit in as Native Hawaiians, as Indigenous people? Not that I speak on behalf of an entire group of people,
Right, of
but
course.
our conversations have fostered around, regardless of who we are as a person on our looking at our marginalized identities, when we think about the concept of pilina, we see our identities as this entire net connected with other people that therein result into this incredible ecosystem of power and privilege. In one circumstance, I have power in that conversation. I am a Native Hawaiian. I'm an educated Native Hawaiian
With the DMA,
with a DMA
in the
that
faculty position.
and a faculty position that identifies it as Mahu in a community that understands the reverence around that identity. And so when I walk across the street late at night, I don't fear for my life, right? When I'm walking across the street with my Caucasian husband holding hands, we have safety because we are in a community that regards this, my brown identity, as important.
Right.
Would
But
I be able to would I be able to have that exact same conversation if it was last year in upstate New York or 2 years ago in upstate New York? Probably not. But what I think is important is that as an Indigenous person, it is my responsibility to know and to proclaim and to do my work as a choral artist, as a choral conductor, in ensuring that this conversation happens and is discussed and is facilitated within moments of learning as we enter into the fall, and that my Native and Indigenous students understand that they have relationship with that narrative and they themselves have a Hawaiian idea of what allyship looks like amongst the Black Lives Matter movement.
Andre and I spoke with Dr. Jace Kaholokula Saplan in early July. You can learn more about Jace's work with the Nā Wai Chamber Choir at www.navaichamberchoir.com. The Choral Commons podcast is hosted by Emily Amrine and Andre de Quadros, produced by Emily Amrine in partnership with Chorus America and the Eric Erickson International Choral Center, and supported by listeners like you.
Additional institutional and creative partners include the Harvard Choral Program, St. Olaf College, University of Hawai'i Choirs, University of San Diego, Manado State University Choir, Nā Wai Chamber Choir, and Voices 21C.
If your organization would like to join our list of sponsors, please reach out to us at thechoralcommons@gmail.com or consider joining our community of supporters on our website, where you can schedule regular donations of $5 or $10 a month to help us offset the costs of producing these programs.
The Choral Commons aims to provide a space for choirs and conductors to envision innovative and equity-centered practice. We produce podcasts and interactive webinars and offer curated resources on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We connect and engage community in meaningful dialogue on pedagogy and practice, and incubate creative, artistic, and compassionate choral projects that empower choral music organizations to work for a just and peaceful world. Join the conversation at www.thechoralcommons.com. The Nā Wai Chamber Choir performed the music you heard throughout today's episode at the ACDA Western Division Conference in March. The excerpts you heard were drawn from two pieces. The first excerpt was from the chant Olio Nā Wai by Nā Wai member Lilinoi Kauahikaua, outlining the significance of the name Nā Wai and the group's intention as an ensemble. The second excerpt was from Ku Ha'aheo, composed by Mahu educator, community leader, and musician Kumu Hina. The song is a sonic banner for the Ku Kiai Mauna movement, calling on the Hawaiian people to rise together for the protection and preservation of their homeland. You can listen to the full recording on our website, www.thechoralcommons.com.